Daniel Whitaker shoved past the hospital doors like a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Reporters swarmed outside, microphones flashing, questions slicing at him. "Is it true your daughter hasn't spoken a word since the fire?" Someone sneered. "All that money, and he can't buy her voice back?" The insult stung, but Daniel kept walking. Inside, silence pressed down heavier than smoke ever had. Grace lay still, eyes open but locked far away. Machines hummed, nurses whispered. Nothing reached her, not therapy, not toys, not his trembling hand, not even the lullabies he once sang, because Daniel hadn't dared try again since that night. His guilt strangled the very sound in his throat. Then came her, a woman in torn shoes, coat frayed at the cuffs, eyes lit with something fiercer than pity. The guard barked, "Ma'am!" "You can't be here." Daniel waved them off, but she stood her ground. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, voice steady, "I can wake her." Daniel almost laughed. "And who exactly are you?" "Lila Brooks," she answered, "just someone who remembers a song you forgot." Her words landed sharper than any headline. He felt heat crawl up his neck. "You think some tune is going to undo what happened?" Lila leaned closer, unfazed. "Not some tune. Her tune. The lullaby that carried her before the fire ever touched her. Sing it, and she'll answer." Daniel's jaw locked. Sing. In front of strangers. He hadn't even whispered a note in months. His voice was ash, and she didn't understand. He was the reason Grace couldn't bear sound anymore. Yet Lila's gaze pinned him, unwavering. "Money manages silence," she murmured. "Love breaks it." The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel turned away, muttering, "You don't know what you're asking." But the words clung, heavier than any insult. "Sing, and she'll answer." Night stretched long in the ward, fluorescent light washing everything pale. Daniel sat at Grace's bedside, head bowed, watching her small chest rise and fall. She hadn't spoken since the fire, not a single word, not even Dad. And the silence carved him open nightly. Therapists came with charts, with games, with careful tones. Nothing reached her. Daniel paid them all, speech pathologists, neurologists, even child psychologists flown in from across the country. They nodded, scribbled notes, and left. Grace remained locked inside herself. And Lila, she was still here. Somehow, security hadn't managed to keep her away. She appeared in waiting rooms, in corridors, humming faintly under her breath. Songs that Daniel almost recognized, fragments that stirred in his bones like half-forgotten prayers. He hated her persistence, but hated more the part of him that wanted to believe her. One night, unable to stop himself, he snapped, "She's not some machine you reboot with a melody. Stop haunting us." Lila didn't flinch, and she's not a case file you can fix with signatures. She's a child who knows her father's voice. His chest tightened. He hadn't sung to Grace since the blaze. The fire had taken his wife, burned half the house to ruin. That night, he tried to sing her calm, but his voice cracked, and she screamed louder. He never forgave himself. He locked the song away. Lila saw it. She leaned in, gentle but firm. "You think silence keeps her safe. It doesn't. It just keeps you guilty." Her words pierced, and Daniel turned to the corner table. There, scorched from the fire, sat Grace's music box, its gears jammed, silent, a relic of lullabies unsung. Daniel whispered, almost to himself, "And what if my voice makes it worse?" Lila's reply was soft, but it struck like a commandment. "What if it's the only thing that makes it better?" The question hung, daring him to answer. The ward was dim, machines pulsing faintly in the background. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, fingers gripping the armrest as if it were the last solid thing in the world. Grace's face looked carved from porcelain, unmoving, untouched by his presence. Lila stood nearby, humming low, steady as a heartbeat. "Just one note," she urged. "Not for me, for her." Daniel's throat burned before he even began. Memories clawed at him, the fire, his wife's scream, the way his lullaby broke into sobs as smoke filled the nursery. He'd sworn never to sing again. But now, his daughter's silence pressed heavier than his shame. He drew in a breath. The first sound that escaped was ragged, barely a whisper, the ghost of a tune. His voice cracked so hard he winced. He almost stopped. But then, her eyelashes fluttered. Just once, like a leaf trembling in wind. Daniel froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Lila's eyes widened, urging him silently, "Keep going." The second line stumbled out, uneven, but real. Grace's fingers twitched on the blanket. Tears blurred Daniel's sight. He bent forward, letting the words spill, broken though they were. "Sleep, my morning star." The moment stretched. Grace's lips parted as if testing air differently. Nothing came yet, but the flicker was there, a ripple across still water. Daniel choked back a sob, whispering into her ear, "I left you alone with my silence. I won't again." For the first time in months, something shifted between them. Not quite words, not yet, but a thread pulling tight. Lila placed her hand gently on the rail, steady as stone. Daniel collapsed back in his chair, trembling. A single note had cracked the dam. He knew then, silence wasn't impenetrable. It was breakable. And he had just broken it. Days blurred together, but Daniel returned every night, voice raw from trying. Grace's small reactions, an eyelid flicker, a finger curl, a shift in breath, kept him anchored. Still, doctors dismissed it all as reflex. Daniel clenched his fists each time. Reflex or not, he knew she was answering. One evening, Lila sat across from him, humming fragments of something older, deeper, a hymn with edges softened by years. Daniel stiffened. "I know that tune," he muttered. Lila nodded. "Your wife sang it in church. Grace would have heard it before she could walk." Daniel's breath caught. He remembered, his wife cradling Grace at dusk, swaying to the lullaby. The fire had stolen her voice forever. He had buried the song with her. Lila leaned forward. "That's the verse you've been avoiding, the one tied to her memory of her mother. You're afraid it will hurt her." Daniel's chest tightened. She was right. That verse was soaked in grief, but maybe grief was the very door they had to open. He turned toward Grace, hand trembling as he touched her tiny wrist. He began softly, barely audible, voice breaking around each word. "Sleep, my morning star. Your mama's never far." The air shifted. Grace's fingers curled, not random this time, but to the rhythm. Daniel's breath hitched. He kept singing, voice cracking, spilling out the line that tore him apart. "She holds you through the flame, calls your sweetest name." Grace's lips trembled. A tiny sound escaped. No word, just a note, but it matched his. Tears streaked his face as he sang again and again, each line carving open what he had locked away. For the first time since the fire, the lullaby filled the room whole. Not perfect, not polished, but alive. And Grace. She was listening. Listening didn't end with one night. It stretched into a string of dusks where Daniel arrived hoarse and left emptied, and still he came back. The lullaby was no longer a relic. It was a rope thrown across a river. Lila kept time with a hum that stayed out of the way, the kind you feel in your bones before you notice it in your ears. Between them, they built a ritual. Daniel sat where Grace could see the shadow of his profile, hand resting light on the rail, voice starting as a whisper and rising only when her breathing steadied. He planted a pattern, 3 soft taps on the bed rail before the first line. Tap, tap, tap. A promise, a door knock, a way to say I'm here without scaring the moment. The music box, repaired only to the point of stubbornness, gave a single defiant click, like a heartbeat refusing to quit. No melody yet, just willingness. On paper napkins stolen from the cafeteria, Daniel wrote fragments of lyrics, tiny revisions that would mean nothing to anyone else and everything to his daughter. He taped them to the wall until the wall became a quilt. Nurses pretended not to notice. A few smiled when they thought no one was watching. The night cleaners slowed their carts when the verse about the flame floated out, as if the words might spill. Sometimes the staff charted her responses as artifact. He heard the term and tasted metal, reflex, artifact, whatever the label. His little girl's fingers curled on the second line every time. Not coincidence. A pattern. Between songs, guilt still prowled. He'd say, almost under his breath, "I'm sorry I disappeared inside my own silence." Then he'd sing, because apology without action is just another locked door. At the end of one long evening, he tapped the rail, tap, 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 and Grace's eyelids flickered as if trying to answer. Not yet, but close enough that Daniel could feel the hinge warming, the door loosening on its screws. Tomorrow, he promised her. "I'll be here tomorrow." Tomorrow came with a clipboard. Administration called it a review. Risk protocols, visitor limits, staff boundaries, phrases that made hope sound like a hygiene violation. Lila waited in the hall, hands folded, listening as two supervisors explained that unscreened visits complicated liability. Daniel kept his jaw still. He thanked them for caring about safety. Then, very calmly, he said, her first eye flutter happened when the unscreened visitor hummed. They exchanged the look bureaucrats use when facts are inconvenient. We classify it as unusual, one of them said. Not actionable. Another suggested a trial without Lila to control variables. Daniel stared at the floor until the tile lines sharpened into grid paper. He was done bargaining with the kind of certainty that never had to hold a child's hand. He documented everything. Timestamps, blood pressure shifts, the exact second Grace's fingers curled when he reached the word morning. He pasted new napkins to the wall, a ledger of small mercies. Nurses who weren't on the committee began to drift closer during the song, pretending to adjust IV lines as their eyes watered. That night, Lila stood in the doorway, unsure if she should enter. Policy had drawn a chalk line around her. Daniel nodded once. She stepped back, honoring the line, and hummed from the hall, barely audible. Even from there, the harmony found the melody. He began with the taps. Tap, 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 and sang low so the room felt like a secret. Grace's breathing matched his phrasing, the way tide matches moon. Halfway through, a junior doctor slipped in with a tablet and froze when he heard the lyric about calling your sweetest name. He muttered, non-replicable, but he didn't leave. Daniel sang through the ache anyway. Between verses, he whispered, if there's a bridge between where you are and where I am, I'll keep walking it. Outside, Lila's hum swelled 1 degree, a sound like a hand at the small of your back, steadying you across. On the 4th night, after the meeting, the ward felt like a chapel. Nobody announced. Lights dimmed, the hallway quieted, even the machines seemed to breathe along. Daniel took his place, fingertips finding the rail. Tap, tap, tap. He waited 3 heartbeats for her eyes to soften. Then he began. Sleep, my morning star. The word star hung in the air as if unsure which way to fall. Daniel risked more voice than usual, the kind that cracked but didn't break. He kept going, past the safer lines, into the verse he'd avoided the longest, the one with her mother's name inside it like a lit coal. She holds you through the flame. Grace's mouth trembled. A sound formed and vanished. He leaned closer. Your mama's never far. The tiniest echo answered him, a breath syllable that wasn't language yet, but arrived on the same note he had just sung. The junior doctor, the one who called things non-replicable, stepped closer without realizing. Lila, outside the doorway, hummed a single tone that steadied like a compass. Daniel tried the first line again. Sleep. My morning. Grace's lips shaped the rest before she had voice for it. Then, like a match deciding to be fire, she whispered, star. Barely there, a grain of sound, but unmistakable. Daniel forgot to breathe. Tears filled his eyes so fast the room blurred. He swallowed a sob and said, careful as glass, hi, baby. Her eyes slid toward him, slow, deliberate. Dad, she whispered, the word rough as a scraped knee and more beautiful than any symphony. Sing it again. The room froze around the miracle. No heralds, no trumpets. Just a girl returning by way of a song she already knew. Daniel placed his forehead gently against hers and began once more, voice steady now, because courage is repetition. The next mornings changed shape. Not a parade, just a new kind of ordinary, fragile as wet paint. Daniel arrived with tea he never remembered drinking, and Grace watched him with the focus of someone learning the route home. Words came in soft handfuls. Again. More. Dad. Names of colors, names of toys, and once, quiet as weather, Mom. They practiced a ritual the staff could chart without condescension now. 3 taps, the first line, a pause for Grace to find her note. Sometimes she only mouthed the word, sometimes a whisper landed and stayed. The junior doctor started appearing coincidentally on their floor. He didn't speak, he listened. When he finally did, it was to ask, what key are you in? Daniel laughed for the first time in months. Whatever key her breath chooses. The wall of napkins kept growing, pencil-smudged proof of a path. Lila visited less, by design. She stood at the threshold one afternoon, scarf folded in her hands like a small flag of truce. "You don't need me in the room anymore," she said, not with sadness, but with the soft pride of a teacher watching a student outgrow training wheels. Daniel shook his head. "We do." She smiled. "You have what I had to bring." Before she left, she tied that bright scarf to the music box key, a ribbon of entrusted care. As she stepped back into the corridor, Grace tapped the rail, 1, 2, 3, and whispered, "Hi." Lila's laugh floated down the hall, low and warm. "Hi, little star." Press inquiries started to thrum at the edges, but the door stayed shut. The story wasn't for headlines yet. It was for evening light on a hospital blanket, for the small hand finding a father's thumb, for a lullaby that survived smoke and came back carrying air. And every night, when the world quieted, Daniel sang them both toward morning. The ward didn't transform overnight. The fire scars still burned in memory, and Grace's voice arrived in fragments, like seashell pieces, sharp and beautiful, but incomplete. Still, the days carried a gentler pulse. Daniel brought books to read aloud, not to fill silence, but to invite it to bloom. Grace tapped the bed rail before he opened a page. 3 beats, their private password. Nurses began to linger a little longer in the doorway, some pretending to check monitors while listening to the lullaby return, line by fragile line. On the wall, napkins had multiplied into a tapestry of penciled lyrics, smudged fingerprints, and half-drawn stars. It became less a ledger of progress and more a declaration. Silence isn't our language anymore. Even the staff who once called it artifact now asked if they could hum along while adjusting IV drips. Grace's words grew bolder. Again. Dad. Star. Then one night, a single word cut through Daniel's chest. Mom. It came soft as wind, but it broke open a space he'd walled off. He kissed her hair, whispered, "She's here, sweetheart. She's in every note." Outside, press requests stacked, curiosity mounting. Administrators debated case studies, controlled reports. Daniel shielded Grace from all of it. "She doesn't need to be studied," he said firmly. "She needs to be heard." Every evening, he returned with the same ritual. Tap, tap, tap. Grace echoed it now, her small hand drumming back. For the first time, they weren't locked in the same silence. They were building a language no committee could classify. And when Daniel closed his eyes each night, he heard not just his own broken voice, but his daughter's fragile harmony threading through the dark. One afternoon, sun cut through the window, turning the white sheets gold. Grace was propped against pillows, a sketchbook in her lap. She tapped 3 times, pointed at Daniel, then at herself. "Sing." Her command, not request. Daniel laughed, shook his head. "You're the boss now." That was when Lila appeared, scarf bright against her worn coat. She lingered at the threshold, hesitant. Daniel gestured her in. Grace's eyes lit, and for the first time she whispered, "Lady." The word wobbled, but landed. Lila's laugh filled the room like a chord resolving. Daniel began the lullaby, voice steady. Halfway through, Lila joined, weaving harmony that wrapped around his melody like vines climbing a strong branch. Grace clapped, 3 little taps against the rail. Music wasn't miracle anymore. It was memory, ritual, family. When the last note faded, Lila stood. She tied her scarf to the music box key, the knot firm. "It's your turn to carry it," she said quietly. Daniel swallowed hard. "I don't know how to thank you." Lila shook her head. "You already did. You sang." Grace whispered again, "Stay." Lila bent close, kissed her forehead, then stepped back. "You don't need me in the room anymore, little star. You've got your father's voice now." She left before either could argue, her footsteps steady down the hall. Daniel sat in silence, scarf bright in his hands, knowing something had shifted. She hadn't vanished. She'd entrusted. Weeks later, the hospital corridors buzzed with something new. Other families began to ask about the song. Daniel never offered it as a miracle, only as a practice. "Sing what they already know," he told them, "even if your voice shakes." Word spread beyond the ward. Grace grew stronger, her vocabulary blossoming. Sometimes she stumbled, sometimes she froze, but the lullaby always carried her back. And Daniel, once ashamed of his voice, now sang in waiting rooms, in stairwells, in corners where other parents leaned in to listen. Reporters came knocking. He refused interviews. Instead, he funded music and memory nights in pediatric burn units and homeless shelters, crediting not himself but a woman who reminded me silence is not protection. The napkin quilt was moved to the playroom, where children added their own scribbled verses. It became less a record of one family and more a chorus stitched together by dozens of hands. Daniel still wept sometimes when Grace whispered, "Mom," but grief had become a bridge, not a barricade. In every shaky syllable, he heard proof that healing wasn't perfection, it was permission. And each night, when the world quieted, Grace tapped the rail. Tap, 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 before drifting into sleep. He answered with the song, not because he believed it was magic, but because it was theirs. Time passed, but the story lingered like a refrain that refuses to fade. In the city, whispers spread, not about wealth or scandal, but about a father who sang his daughter back from silence, and a homeless woman who carried the memory of a lullaby when everyone else had forgotten. Grace's laughter returned, rough at first, then ringing like chimes. She still bore scars, still carried shadows of fire, but she also carried music. And that music spilled into classrooms, into hospital corridors, into shelter basements where strangers hummed verses passed along like hand-me-down coats. The music box, once silent, was coaxed into life by a careful craftsman. It played again, wobbly, imperfect, but determined. When Daniel wound the key, Grace would press her ear against it, giggling at its stubborn song. "It's us," she'd say. "A little broken, still playing." Lila was rarely seen after that. Some said she left the city, others that she blended back into its quiet corners. But her presence lingered in every chorus children stitched into the napkin quilt, now hanging across the ward wall like a flag of resilience. No headline ever captured the truth. Skeptics still rolled their eyes. But the ones who mattered, the children, the parents, the weary who carried their own silences, knew, they remembered. And every time the lullaby rose again, in a hospital room, or a shelter bed, or a living room humming with soft light, it carried the same message. Where silence ends, healing begins. Not everyone believed. That didn't matter. What mattered was that Grace did. And one night, when she tucked her head under Daniel's chin and whispered, "Sing it again, Dad," the world outside could wait. The song belonged to them first, and through them, to everyone else.